What we want to do in this second session is to imagine this sort of metaphor that we have realities of our past, which we began in some small ways to probe in this past session. A lot of what this past session was about was just sort of taking a good, clear look at reality. And that's a hard thing to do, and yet it's such a very necessary thing to do. But now we want to turn a bit and begin to ask, what do we take with us as we move on into the future? What is it about our heritage, about the things that make us who we've been? What is it about that past, that heritage, that might be useful to us as we look to the future, as we think about the future of our churches and our participation in what God is doing in the world? What about our past might be needful, or even something that's just simply non-negotiable for us as we move forward into the future? So that's sort of the direction we're headed. My name is Carson Reed, and I serve as the director for the Siburt Institute for Church Ministry and work with Royce and others serving congregations and churches across the country. And I have a couple of colleagues with me today. On my far right is Kent Smith. Ken is a long-time professor here at ACU, now teaching adjunct and semi-retirement. I mean, he's a busy fellow and does a lot of traveling and work with congregations and church communities, particularly church communities that may be a little bit invisible to some of us. He works with communities around the idea of what it means to live in intentional community with one another. And he brings a wealth of wisdom and experience with congregations and churches across the country. In the middle, right here in the middle, is David Kneip, my colleague who teaches church history, early church history, and theology, and is one of our favorite, one of the favored professors for our undergraduate program. And David is also a person who deeply loves the church. He's a Texan, so, you know, Temple, Texas, yeah. But we got him up to Indiana, where I have roots for a few years with his doctorate, so he's got some Midwest things going for him too, which makes him all the better as far as I'm concerned. But both Kent and David are persons who are deeply connected and tied to our heritage and to our movement, and are both persons who have lived and practiced ministry in our movement, as also persons who have studied in our movement. And our conversation today for this next hour or so is going to center in around what is it that's good about our heritage? What's useful? If we could use the metaphor and press it a little further, what would we put in our carry-on bag when we travel abroad so that we know that when we get there we've got something? I just got back from Australia 4 days ago, and some of my suitcases got here on time. Some came in several hours later. Thank you very much, American Airlines. But the things that were important were in my carry-on bag. What would we take out of our heritage? What would that be? And to do that, one of the ways I want us to think about our heritage is actually a way that our own church fathers and mothers thought about our heritage. Robert Richardson, the prime biographer of Alexander Campbell, wrote a little pamphlet in 1855 called Principles of the Reformation. I bet about 1.5 people have ever read that book in this room. It got lost in the Civil War, and it was one of the greatest shames of the Civil War because Richardson was framing our heritage in such a winsome, positive way. When he would talk about baptism, he would say, we immerse people because everybody agrees about immersion. That's a point of unity that we can all share in that. Or he would talk about the Lord's Supper, and he would say, we do it every Sunday because everyone can see that that makes a lot of sense. If you do it less than that, that's okay, but we're going to do it this particular way. He was taking the heritage and framing it in a way that was winsome and hopeful and life-giving. And that's the sort of thing that we want to imagine for ourselves. Another way to think about it is with the term that Kevin Rowe articulated about 12 years ago when he talked about something called traditioned innovation. traditioned innovation. That if you don't have tradition and legacy that gives you roots, you just go off any old which way, innovating this way and innovating that way, you won't have anything to give you ballast. But if you hang on to just your tradition and keep on doing the same things for the same reasons, for the same ways, et cetera, you may find yourself losing your place in the cultural climates that you're inhabiting. So Rowe talks about how do we take our traditions and allow them to innovate and move forward and yet give us some sense of our past and our legacy. Does that make sense to you? That's the sort of hopefulness that we want to talk and reflect about our heritage today as we move the conversations forward. You know, Kent, when we got together and began talking about this, you told a story about, I think it was Abraham Smith, your great-great-grandfather?
4 greats.
4 greats, oh my goodness. And it was a marvelous story that might help us kind of begin to set the stage reflecting about our heritage and what are there about our heritage that might be something we need to get a hold of and hang on to tight.
Sure. Well, Abraham Montague Shelton, that's a name to remember, isn't it? Was my great-great-great-great-grandfather who was born in the year 1800 in Logan County, Kentucky. Now, for the church historians among us here, that date and that place may ring a bell because it's the same year that a very important event happened, the Red River Revival. And you might remember that Barton Stone was there largely as an observer at that event, but he was so impressed and so amazed at the way that God was working and moving in people's lives in that event that not long later he became the orchestrator or the host of what many would say was one of the key beginning points for the American Restoration Movement, namely the Cane Ridge Revival, right? So Abraham, my ancestor, grew up in this context, this swirl of people who are coming to faith, excited on the American frontier about Jesus, and he, according to family lore at least, was an illiterate unbeliever. He was in total disagreement with all this business, and so he set out to prove his friends wrong, but he realized to do that he was going to have to figure out how to read the Bible. So he taught himself to read, and you kind of might be able to guess where this story is going, right? He realized as he was reading that actually the people he'd been arguing with were right, and he was wrong, and he became a follower of Jesus. Abraham went on to have a large family, and each of his children became believers over time. He developed a ministry as sort of a farmer preacher on the Kentucky frontier there, and loved and blessed and served that whole region for many, many years. In 1870, so maybe 50 years later, one of Abraham's sons, now an elder in the church, donated a piece of land for a schoolhouse in Logan County, in that part of Logan County. And he did so with the stipulation that the building could be used during the week for school, and on the weekends, it would be available to the 4 communities of faith in the area, namely the Methodists, the Baptists, the Presbyterians, and the Churches of Christ. And for another 12 years, that's where that local congregation of the Churches of Christ met once a month. And then in 1884, they built their very own church building. Lots of folks in those days, especially in the South, were finally coming up with the funds to build a for-purpose church building. And it's still there today, the Kedron Church of Christ. Sometime when you just really long for a lovely drive, slide on over to Logan County, Kentucky, and look up the Kedron Church of Christ. Still a little congregation of God's people meeting there. Well, one of the things that I think is really important about what we put in our bags and carry with us on into the future is just to remembering that our roots are deep in community. That little community of God's people meeting there in Logan County lived for 50 years without a church building, but they were following Jesus with great passion. They were meeting together in each other's homes. They were really doing life together, right? This is the walkable world of the 19th century. This is a time when people are surrounded by folks mostly that they've known their whole life, right? And so whether you're going to church or you're going to school or you're working, you're mostly dealing with people that you know. And so it's kind of an unintentional community, but it's a very intense community. These are the people you fight with. These are the people that you love, but largely these are the people who are family to you. And that's our roots. We deep down inside, we were looking earlier, Susan was pointing out how most of our congregations are still small congregations, right? 60 or less is the majority. And there's a deep kinship that is often found in those congregations, a deep, wonderful love for one another. We don't just call each other brother and sister, which you may have noticed is a little bit weird in our world today. Grown-ups calling each other brother and sister, but we really, really, to an amazing degree, do feel that kindred, that filial relationship. And I think that's one of the ways that our longing to reflect some of the life of the earliest church was true of the earliest Stone-Campbell movement. And I think it's something that we ought to notice, celebrate, and carry with us moving forward.
Yeah, thanks, Kent. There's something about that deep sense of community that has formed us down deep in our DNA. David, you want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, sure. One of the things that was making me think of, Carson mentioned that we lived in Indiana. We lived in northern Indiana, near the Michigan border for about 5.5 years while I was in graduate school. And we were not far away from Amish country. We think of Amish country in Pennsylvania, but really it kind of stretches this way across Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and even in Iowa, I believe. And so we were able to go and visit a couple of Amish communities. And one of the things, that is just kind of amazing is that these communities have survived for a couple of 100 years. And some subgroups, they, like us, have had a tendency to subdivide over the years, unfortunately. But some of their groups still don't meet in church buildings. They meet in one another's homes. And it is similar to what you're describing. Of course, very agrarian. We think of, the Amish working the land in the red barns. I think that's one of the things that really has helped them survive. They're not related to us historically, but I think they have some similar realities in their church life, and that's something that we might be able to not imitate as though we don't have that, but still preserve and celebrate it for the part that we have.
I find it fascinating that sense of connection to the land and to the community, to agrarianness, I think it's even reflected in the ways in which we name our church buildings, right? Our congregations. It's the Fifth and Vine Church, or it's the Second and the whatever, or the South Side, or the North Side, or some community. New Zion, which was my family church in the 100 some odd years ago in Oklahoma. That sense of connectedness to each other and to a sense of place is something that plays itself out deeply, even to the place of sort of forming us in our identity. Back to Indiana and graduate school, you told a story not long ago about I think it was a colleague of yours who grew up in Churches of Christ, and it kind of came out in a surprising way in a do you remember this conversation?
I do. So one of my colleagues there was a fellow Church of Christ member from the South. If you have lived outside of the Bible Belt, there is a particular joy of finding fellow Church of Christ people. You sort of cling together. We met each other on the first day of graduate school orientation, and our wives and we were friends going forward. And he told me a story one time that really resonated a lot with some of my experiences, especially getting into high school and getting to know Christians of other varieties. He grew up in the Churches of Christ, went to a Christian school, still in the South, but not from the Churches of Christ. And while he was there, he got to know these other students. And the other students were talking about their personal relationship with Jesus and how important that was to them. And he remembered thinking, what are y'all talking about? I mean, that was just language that, at least at this time, this would have been probably in the 90s sometime, just did not compute. And the more he studied and thought and lived, he realized that The reason is that's not really language that we've particularly used in our movement. It's not that we don't encourage people to have personal relationships with Jesus. It's just that our relationship with God has tended to be from within community. And the phrase that he used that really stuck with me was he said, our spirituality, if you use that word to mean, what does it mean that you have a relationship with God? You have a contemplative spirituality, an active spirituality. He said, ours is a congregational spirituality. What does it mean to be with the Lord? It means to be with the body of believers. These days, I think just like it's easy for us to be jealous of big churches and feel bad about ourselves when we're small, I think sometimes it's easy for us to feel bad about some of those old traditions like Sunday morning, Sunday night, and Wednesday night, and we kind of make fun of ourselves. We were there every time the doors were open. But I don't think that's a bad thing. The church I grew up in was one of these little small ones that fluctuated from 50 to 150 over the years. It's still that size. And during my growing up time, we had fairly normal Sunday morning worship in our movement. And then Sunday night and Wednesday night, we met for an hour in the building, and we did three things. We sang for about 20 minutes. One of the brothers would share a talk. We didn't have any paid staff for the first 15 years or so of the church's life, and no paid preachers for 30 years. Just would take turns sharing thoughts, and then we'd spend the last 20 minutes sharing prayer requests. And as a kid, we'd find out who was saying the prayer, and we would be very sad because we knew that this person prayed a long time. I remember, sometimes I can tell you some stories of sort of horrifying misunderstandings in a child's mind of what the prayer request meant. But I still remember, some of the jokes we would have and this person or that person. But as an adult, I think about what that was like for me growing up, spending year after year after year, week after week, twice a week, singing and sharing and having prayer requests. And we knew each other, we knew each other well. And my wife and I have been privileged in Abilene to work with one of the community ministries that's sponsored by the Highland Church of Christ. And that's more or less what we do there. And there are people from the neighborhood. Some of them are very new in their relationship with God. And the same things happen. So it makes me think it's not just something about that church I grew up in. There's something about that way of doing things that builds community.
Yeah. I see you're about to jump in there. Go ahead, Kent. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I think what you're saying, David, really points to something that many Christians have reached for down through the ages, which is this notion of the priesthood of all believers. But the truth is that the priesthood of all believers is only realized in contexts where we actually know each other, right? And that points toward the critical importance of intimate relationships in the family of God. The reason that frontier preachers like my ancestor had such an impact over so many generations is because they were known and they knew people that they loved. And so they were able to care for and to call out the gift and the grace in each of those people out of a deep relationship of respect and mutual affirmation of that gift and that grace. There's been a lot of studies over the years through folks in the sociology of religion who say, hands down, most of the people who give themselves to passionate ministry over a lifetime come from smaller groups. Why is that? Well, because they had a chance to practice their faith from early on in their lives. They were known, they were seen, they were affirmed. If our primary experience of God is as an audience in a large room, if that's our primary way of engaging with God, then we're going to miss a lot of that opportunity to actually imagine what it is to be a priest and a contributor to the whole priesthood of God's people.
And I would add, if I may, you said they were known, they were also needed.
Yes.
Y'all know when you're in small groups, when they start announcing we need more nursery help, they're going to keep announcing more nursery help until we get more nursery help. And sometimes, I don't know about y'all, You had those times when you wish that you knew what God's will was for you, and if God would only speak like God does in the Bible. Sometimes God speaks through the announcements. That little church I grew up in, we started having a baby boom when I was 10 years old. And by the time I was a teenager, every teenager in our church, and there weren't many of us, you had to fight to get off the nursery rotation. And what I became is a person who loves babies. Now, some of that might be from my parents, but I think a lot of it was because I was in a church where it was all hands on deck. We couldn't just slough it off on staff because we didn't have any staff. But you were needed for ministry because it was all the brothers and sisters together.
Exactly. Which is another layer of this, to kind of go in a little deeper, is a sense of sacramentalism that's a part of our heritage and how that gets played out in community life. We're a people who take communion every week. We're a people who practice immersion and baptism. We're people who come together every Sunday, and that deep sense of it. How does that play itself in community? How do those things play into this conversation about community? Any thoughts there?
I would say, Carson mentioned that I teach church history. My other main area is worship, and so in some of my study has been the history of our worship, how those things come together. And there have been a lot of ways that we have defined the word sacrament over the years. That's not a word that we have tended to use, but one definition of the word sacrament that students often can remember is that the sacraments are visible signs of invisible grace. You may have heard this before. All right, so baptism is a visible sign. It is not merely a visible sign, but it's not merely a visible sign because the water is magic. It's not merely a visible sign because of the God who is working in baptism. The same is true of the bread and the cup. But I would say that I think in our movement, the community is the sacrament. We've often wanted to say the church is the people, it's not the building. If a sacrament is a visible sign of invisible grace, that's what we are to each other. Sometimes grace in the sense of redemption, but sometimes just grace in the sense of gift. I remember when I was in college, after I had left home, I was out on the East Coast. I called home my little weekly phone calls home, back when phone calls cost money. And my parents told me about a situation involving a family that I knew where this family at our church, they had a high school-aged daughter and a middle school-aged son, and the mother of the family abandoned them very suddenly. Came out later that she had been dealing with some mental illness of different kinds, but anyway, had just picked up, gone off to Nashville, was going to pursue a country music singing career. And after the initial chaos had subsided and they started trying to pick up the pieces, they figured out that she had been not paying all the bills for about 6 months. And, he was a blue-collar worker. They didn't have much in the way of savings, so he came to the elders and said, this is the situation. Is there anything that the church can do to help? And because we knew them, we knew all of them, the elders said, yeah, absolutely. And so that Sunday, we had the regular offering, and then the language we used was we would take up a love offering. And they just said, here's the situation. They didn't give them a dollar amount. This is what's going on. If you can help in any way, would you please do so? And we passed the basket, and the need from the family was close to $3,000. And in one pass of the basket, right, we didn't have to do let's count it up and send it around again. In one pass of the basket, the church was $5 away from meeting a need. Sometimes, y'all know that the word grace is connected to the word gift. Sometimes we are a gift to one another in material ways. But I think that's a lot of times the way it is in our movement, that the community is that sign of invisible grace.
Yeah, and we could do a lot more with that. But one of the things about that I want to, we can begin to wax nostalgic in this moment. We don't live in an agrarian society. Logan County is a far cry from Dallas or Houston or Abilene, Texas. And even if you live in a small rural community outside of Abilene, the world is changed. We've heard this morning or this afternoon that individualism is so much a part of the fabric of our culture today. How could we let's just, before we move to something else, I'd like to reflect for just a moment at how do we appropriate this deep sense of community in a culture and at a time like we are in now. Just a thought or two, and then we'll move on. But there's something here. How would we attend to that in our context today?
I think any thoughtful person these days can't help but see just such a deep layers upon layers of brokenness in the culture around us, such a need for good news, such a, whether it's the need for good child care or good elder care, good health care, creation care, for crying out loud, an ability to deal with the deeply broken and addictive world that we're in, and maybe above all of that, just the sad way that our attention has been stolen. Sad way that we have just lost our attention for what matters most, right? I think thoughtful people all over this country, Christians and not Christians, recognize some of that brokenness. And so, to reclaim a sense of mission, it's back to what was said at one of the tables earlier, I think we've really got to reclaim an imagination for what does it mean to live good news in our time. And I think we have, again, in this deep awareness of the importance of love embodied in true family-like relationships, we have the capacity to be on mission with God and to truly represent something that folks around us are going to say, if we can do it, how can I get in on that? And I think about the contrast of the numbers that we were seeing earlier this morning, people pouring out of churches right and left, and the story of Jesus about what the kingdom is like. The kingdom's like a man who's strolling through a field, and suddenly he looks down and he sees treasure. And in his joy, the gospel says, he goes and sells everything he has in order to get it. That's what the kingdom is like. Show me where the communities of God's people are living in a way that evokes that kind of response. And I'll show you a church that's not declining, but is becoming a powerful agent for transformation in the culture.
I think the thing in my mind, and this is, in some ways, this may sound like an old-fashioned answer, but I have read somewhere that we should not give up the habit of meeting together as some have done. And I think it was a wise person who said that. Sometimes we can react to our past as though everything in the past was legalistic because there was some legalism in the past. But I don't think committing to being together is automatically legalistic. And I bring that up in this context because we have, they're not so much young children anymore, sort of middle childhood age kids at our house, and it's busy and it's hectic. And, sometimes it's easy to say, because now we're in a big church. Well, do we really need to, they won't really notice if we're not there. Our small group is meeting, but it's been a difficult day. Maybe we'll just take this week off, and for the sake of the family, we'll stay at home. And I know that feeling, and we're probably kind of preaching to the choir here that y'all may not be ones that need the encouragement to continue to meet together. But maybe we do. Our culture does teach us to take care of our own needs before we take care of the needs of others. There is sometimes wisdom in that, right, on the airplane when the masks drop down. But sometimes that can be, I think, seductive, that we need to care mainly about ourselves more than one another. And the Spirit can't work among us if we're not there together, it seems to me.
Thank you. We've talked a little bit about community. We've touched base with our sort of sacramental dimensions. We've talked about the priesthood of all believers. And Kent, you were pressing into this a little bit too with a sense, there's actually been a sense of purpose or mission that's been a part of the Stone-Campbell tradition. Sometimes that mission was perceived too tightly wound up with national identity. But nonetheless, there was a sense of that we exist for something larger than ourselves. and that connectedness to what God is doing in the world has been a part of our heritage and the way we've thought about things, even to the point that historically, and maybe one of you or both of you would like to play with this a bit, of seeing ourselves as distinct from the culture itself. And we're going back prior to 1920s, prior to the Civil War, really to find some of this really playing itself out. But sort of a deep contrast community, a sense of the. You mentioned Via the Amish. Via the Amish, yeah, okay. Yeah. So I'm picking on you. You mentioned the Amish. So let's go back to this Anabaptist notion of that the church stands, the people of God stand at some distance to culture or to the politics and life of the kingdom. And how does that play maybe is something we might want to put in our suitcase?
Yeah. No, I think that absolutely is. One of the things you can do looking back through church history is see different relationships that different church groups have had with the world, right, in that sort of John's gospel sense, that world out there that's sort of dangerous and sketchy. And the classic expression of this, if you want a book to read, Richard Niebuhr's book, Christ and Culture, which was a set of lectures that he delivered in Austin, actually, back in 1949, I believe, and was published as a book. And he's got this little schema and different attitudes toward the world. And one that I think a lot of times we have embodied is what he calls Christ and culture, or maybe Christianity and culture in paradox, where we live in tension with one another. We're connected. We're not completely shut off, but we're always a little bit worried about the world. And sometimes the worry takes over. But I think it is wise. I mentioned having young kids, right? We teach them not to run across the street because sometimes a car is coming. Right, you need to have an eye out for that. But I was thinking about a student I taught once who was not from the Anabaptist community, but had a family in his hometown who was, and so he was close with them and really respected them. And he said, these were people who did not work full time. They had been able to arrange their jobs so that they made enough money that they could survive, they could live, but not so much money that they would have to pay taxes. And the reason that they did that was not because they were against paying taxes, but because they knew what percentage of the federal budget goes to the Department of Defense. And as Anabaptists, who are historically pacifists, they could not in good conscience work hard enough so that they could have more money, because part of that money would then go to support what they perceived to be kind of imperialistic, domineering, aggressive federal government. And so they worked less on purpose and made less on purpose. They lived on about an acre of land. They had gardens. They grew as much of their own food as possible. And he said they were some of the happiest people I knew because they had time to serve others, and they weren't really quite caught up so much in the rat race. That was a story that always stuck with me, because that's a way of being in the world but not of the world. That's not quite the same as, I grew up with a guy in my church saying he grew up in the country, kind of way back in the country, and what he was taught about ethics as a kid was don't drink, smoke, dance, cuss, or chew, or associate with people that do, which is not bad advice, but might need some nuancing over time. There's going to be some limits eventually to that. That's one way of living out a Jesus life, given the realities that are on the ground. And that's going to look different in different communities, big towns, small towns, big churches, little churches. But I think having that consciousness of how do we follow Jesus with the gifts that we have, the opportunities we have, but also looking at the challenges that are out there, and being willing to be creative, and being willing to not accept the value systems that the world wants to give us.
Right. That's very deeply a part of our roots, right?
Absolutely, yeah. Both Doug and Wes mentioned that one of the unfortunate pieces of our heritage, I think a lot of us would say, has been our sectarianism, our separatedness from one another. But, part of what's gone along with that, and I think maybe something to pull out of the heritage and stick in the bag, is sort of being comfortable with not being just like everybody else, right? Sort of realizing that it's okay for the people of God to not have the same habits, the same attitudes, the same kind of core commitments and rhythms of life as the world, as we would say, around us have. And so I like to think about a kind of redeemed separateness. I don't like sectarianism, but I do like the idea that we can be a contrast culture and be at home with that idea, that it's okay to be different from others. And frankly, friends, you know this. If you're paying attention in your congregations, we certainly know it here as teachers at ACU, and other folks in education know that our young people are not interested in more of the same. They're just not interested. And if all we're going to do is just be like everybody else, doing the same thing mostly that everybody else is doing with a thin veneer of church attendance on top of that, we will not capture their hearts. They have to know that what we're up to matters, that we're on mission with God in a way that is going to be good news. And that calls for a contrast culture. And that calls for us to be at home in a place that we've often been, which is we're not like everybody else. Let's be different, and let's be different in a way that truly is good news.
Thanks, Ken. So another one of these dimensions that is not distinctive to us alone, but one of the features of our heritage has been a deep sense of congregationalism, or that big $64 word, autonomy, that every church sort of sorts itself out and plies its way forward. And like many things, that has its gifts and strengths. It also has its liabilities, right? But is there something about that in our day and time, in the time of the diminishment of Christendom, a rise of pluralism, many of the things that we've spoken about earlier this afternoon? Is there something about that that might actually be something we'd want to hang on to or utilize in some ways? Anything come to your mind there that would make that a hopeful or constructive frame for us to work with?
I'm a little hesitant here, just because we've done a really good job over the years of highlighting ourselves by bashing others.
Yeah.
And so I'm a little hesitant to do that. But I do think that something we see, especially, I mean, you mentioned younger people these days, you know, there is an understandable distrust of big institutions out there in the world, and the church has not been immune from that. Stories in the news this week about lawsuits among the Boy Scouts. I was a tiger cub all the way up to an eagle, and it just hurts to see stories of abuse taking place in the Boy Scouts. I did my graduate work at a Catholic institution, and it hurt my heart over the years to see the stories come out about abuse in the Catholic Church. There are great opportunities that come with big organizations, and there are huge liabilities that come when power can go unchecked, when there are not, even when there are restraints in place. I mean, good grief, just the human heart will go to some really dark places. I see that in my own life. And so I'm not quite sure. I'm not a marketing teacher, so I don't know how we should go about branding in a way to emphasize local autonomy. It might be something that we need to live out, live in an autonomous way, but in a charitably autonomous way, right? That I can be separate from the world, but still connected with a brother or sister congregation, and also do things my way, and not do things always the same way you do, but not condemn you for it. I mean, there's a tension that's there that I think we can find. It probably demands some amount of relationship building with people in other places, whether it's other congregations of Churches of Christ, other ministers in a town, other church groups, getting to know other people so that we can see really who we are. But I think there are probably ways we can live it out. And then, of course, deal with the sin that we have in our own house, because it will surface.
There was a fellow named Walter Percy who wrote a really provocative little article back in the early 80s, which asked the question, why are there no Hittites in New York City? Now, isn't that a great article title. But if you stop and think about it, 3,600 years ago, one of the major world powers was the Hittite Empire. It was Israel's big neighbor to the northeast, and Israel was a comparatively tiny little nation at that time, just a band of bands almost. And yet here, 3,600 years later, if you go to New York City, you will find almost, let's just say, zero evidence of Hittite civilization. But you'll find a lot of evidence of Jewish civilization in New York City. Why is that? I mean, an easy answer is, well, God cares about Israel, but that's probably not the question that Percy was asking. I think he was wanting us to think deeply about what is it about the Jewish people that has allowed them to not only survive but thrive across the planet, and to be found in our time in major cities around the world. And one of the things that I think is really intriguing about that is just to think about the fact that every Friday night, devout Jewish families get together. They light the candles. The mother and the father speak a blessing over their children and remind them of how they are a part of the people of God and how each of them has demonstrated that, and maybe in the past week. The next morning, they get up and they walk to synagogue, which means they are in a neighborhood among people who see them regularly, week by week, year by year, and they are known. And in those gatherings, they remember again who we are. We're the people of God. We have this story that carries our life forward together. The rhythms of attention are universal across the community, but they're also stunningly contextualized to that particular street in New York City where they live, or that little enclave in Babylon where they lived, or wherever it is in the world that they found themselves. So the ability to both hold on to the great stories through steady rhythms of attention that we all share, as well as the ability to pay very close attention to where we are and the people around us. That kind of wonderful flexibility of universally shared but also deeply contextual, I think is something that we have and that we can carry forward in our bag.
Thank you.
And I'd say, by the way, another book recommendation, but this is fiction, so it's maybe more your preference. If you want to see how that plays out, I live in Abilene. We have a very small synagogue. I don't encounter Jewish people on a regular basis here, as I have in other places I've lived. The novels of the author Chaim Potok, you may be familiar with him, The Chosen, My Name is Asher Lev. These are some of his more well-known ones, writing in the mid-20th century. He's writing about Jews in New York City, among other places, and they really capture a lot of the things that you're talking about. You know how sometimes reading about things in stories lets you catch something in a different way than being taught it. So throw that out as something that might be of benefit to you.
Thank you. We're moving quickly to where I want to invite you to some conversations at your table. There are other things that we could easily talk about that I think are distinctives. In some of our preparation conversations, we talked about such things as our shared sense of leadership or distributed leadership. That's distinctive to, or one of the distinctives of our heritage, not unique to us by any means. But is there something about that is useful to us? We've talked about at some length about the practice of reading the Bible and how the Bible serves in an authoritative way for us, and the need, as that's been hinted at already today, of reframing that, not to it becomes the thing that becomes our idol, but how and what ways do we let the voice of Scripture, the voices of Scripture, speak to where our true source of authority lies in and through the witness of Jesus Christ. That there's some reframing, some appropriating we may need to do with how we handle Scripture. It's not that Scripture's not important, it is, but maybe the way in which we've utilized it has been limiting, and we may need to use our imagination and reflection to reappropriate that in some ways. What about the term restoration itself? Is there some liveliness to it that might see a reframing of that from thinking about our work in restoring something of what we might imagine New Testament Christianity to look like, to a reframing and reimagining what it means for us to participate in God's restoration of all things? And there are many other ways in which we could invite and engage reflection about parts of our heritage, but perhaps this has been enough to kind of generate some conversation, some thinking for you today. So I think we have a slide that has a couple of thought questions that we could bring up here. So at your table, I'd like to invite you to take 7 or 8 minutes here to review some of the key elements of our tradition that we've raised today. Things like this deep commitment to community, the priesthood of all believers, and the ways in which the Lord's table, the baptism, that coming to church on Sunday morning might shape us or be useful to us as we move forward. The rhythms of life, the fact that we're out of a free church tradition, which may be a better way, that's the way I often speak of this, that is that the word autonomy sometimes has a lot of negative to it. But is there something about this nimbleness that allows us to adapt to our particular context to live out faithfully God's call in our lives? Shared leadership, Scripture, the way we read the Bible, restoration. I see another one we missed, about the way in which we've had this deep commitment to unity. We've already spoken about that in an earlier hour. How might we appropriate those things and let them live out in new or fresh ways in our context? Which one or two of those elements might be particularly useful in the context that you find yourself in?